The last favor. The phone vibrated once on the kitchen counter, a soft sound swallowed by the hum of the refrigerator. Clara almost ignored it. Nothing important ever arrived after 10 at night. Unknown numbers were usually mistakes, advertisements, or silence on the other end. She picked it up anyway. No missed call, just a voicemail notification. Her first instinct was irritation. She hadn't given this number to anyone new in years. She pressed play without much thought, already turning away, already deciding she would delete it. Then she heard the voice. "Clara, if you're listening to this, it means you waited long enough." Her body froze before her mind could catch up. The glass of water slipped from her hand and shattered against the floor, but she didn't notice. She was no longer in her kitchen. She was nowhere she could name. The voice continued, calm, unmistakable. "I knew you would. You always needed time." Her heart began to pound so violently it felt intrusive.
As if it didn't belong to her anymore. She lowered herself into the chair, the phone trembling between her fingers. The voice was older than she remembered, slightly rougher, but it was his. There was no doubt, no distortion, no echo. Lucas. Dead for 5 years. She pressed pause. The silence that followed was worse. Her mind raced for explanations, old recordings, artificial intelligence, someone playing a cruel joke, but each possibility collapsed under the weight of a single truth. The voice knew things. She pressed play again. "You promised me one thing," Lucas said gently. "Just one. And you said you'd do it if anything happened." Clara felt a sharp pressure behind her eyes. She hadn't thought about that night in years. Or rather, she had thought about it constantly, but only in controlled fragments, carefully edited, safely distant. The message ended abruptly. No goodbye. No explanation. She stared at the screen until it went dark. For a long moment she sat there, listening to the quiet of the apartment, waiting for something. Another vibration, a knock at the door, the sound of her own breathing returning to normal. Nothing happened. But Clara understood, with a certainty that settled deep in her chest, that the life she had built on silence had just been interrupted, and whatever she had buried was no longer willing to stay quiet. Clara didn't clean up the broken glass right away. She remained seated at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around nothing, staring at the darkened phone as if it might speak again on its own. Eventually, the adrenaline ebbed, replaced by a dull, familiar exhaustion. She stood, swept the shards into the trash, wiped the floor with mechanical precision. Order had always been her first response to chaos. By midnight, everything looked the way it always did. Her apartment reflected her perfectly. Neutral colors, clean lines, no unnecessary objects, nothing that carried a story longer than a sentence.
No photographs on the walls, no souvenirs from trips, no reminders of before. Visitors often described the place as calm. Clara preferred the word controlled. She moved through her routines the same way she always had. Teeth brushed for exactly 2 minutes. Alarm set for 6:30. Phone placed face down on the nightstand. She did not check the voicemail again. Some doors, once opened, could not be closed with a second look. Sleep came in fragments. Morning light crept through the curtains, and with it returned the version of Clara the world recognized. At work, she was efficient, reliable, unremarkable in the safest possible way. She spoke when necessary, listened more than she talked, and never volunteered personal details. People trusted her because she never demanded anything from them. Her colleagues knew her as someone who had been through a loss. They didn't ask questions. Clara had learned early that vague truths were easier to maintain than precise lies. Throughout the day,
small moments betrayed her composure. A notification sound made her shoulders tense. A familiar tone in someone's voice sent a brief chill through her spine. She found herself watching reflections, windows, dark screens, polished surfaces, checking her own expression, as if afraid her face might confess something she hadn't spoken aloud. By evening, she was drained. At home, she poured a glass of wine she didn't finish and sat on the couch without turning on the television. Silence pressed in from every corner, thicker now, heavier than it had been the night before. She told herself this life had been hard-won, that stability required sacrifice, that not everything deserved to be reopened. Yet beneath those justifications, another thought lingered, quiet, persistent, unwelcome. She hadn't built this life despite the silence. She had built it because of it. And somewhere in that silence, a promise was still waiting. Before everything became careful and quiet, there had been Lucas.
The memory surfaced slowly, not as a single image, but as a sensation. Warmth, movement, sound. Clara remembered laughter first. Real laughter, the kind that filled a room without asking permission. Lucas had always laughed with his whole body, leaning forward, eyes half closed, as if the world constantly surprised him. They met in their early 20s, at a time when neither of them knew how to be afraid yet. Their friendship formed without effort, built on long conversations that stretched into early mornings and silences that never felt uncomfortable. With Lucas, Clara never felt the need to edit herself. He noticed things others overlooked, asked questions no one else thought to ask. "You disappear when something matters," he once told her, not accusing, just observant, but you always come back. Back then, she took that as reassurance. Lucas trusted her instinctively. He shared ideas before they were fully formed, doubts before they became fears.
When his life began to complicate, new responsibilities, difficult choices, Clara became his anchor, or at least she believed she was. In the months before his death, something shifted. Lucas grew quieter, more distracted. He still smiled, still joked, but his eyes carried a weight Clara didn't recognize at first. When she asked what was wrong, he brushed it aside. "Just things," he said. "I'll tell you when I figure out how." She accepted that answer too easily. Looking back, she could see the signs she chose not to interpret. The way he checked his phone and then put it away without responding. The sudden caution in his words. The nights he insisted on walking her home, even when it made no sense. The last time they met in person, they sat in a small cafe neither of them liked much. Lucas arrived early and had already finished his coffee when she got there. His hands were restless, fingers tapping against the table. "There's something I need to talk to you about," he said. She remembered thinking it was about him, about a decision, a confession, a crossroads. She had no idea it was about the world he had stumbled into, or the danger he believed he was facing. That conversation would change everything. But at the time, Clara only felt a vague discomfort, an instinct to delay. She asked about work, about anything else. Lucas let her for a moment. Later, she would understand that he had been looking at her the way someone looks at a lifeline, not dramatic, not desperate, just certain. And she would realize that even before the promise was spoken, the distance between them had already begun to form. A distance built not from betrayal, but from hesitation. Lucas waited until the cafe began to empty before he spoke again. The afternoon light had shifted, casting long shadows across the small table between them. Clara noticed how his voice lowered, not out of secrecy, but caution, as if the words themselves needed to be handled carefully.
"There's something I need you to promise me," he said. She frowned, half smiling. "That sounds serious." "It is." The smile faded. Lucas took a breath, steadying himself, then leaned forward. For the first time, Clara saw fear clearly on his face. Not panic, not anxiety, but a quiet awareness that something was already in motion. "I found out something I wasn't supposed to," he continued. "At first, I thought it was nothing, just details that didn't add up. But the more I looked, the worse it became. Clara listened without interrupting, her instincts telling her not to rush him. Lucas explained in fragments, careful not to say names aloud, describing connections, documents, conversations overheard at the wrong time, people she recognized, situations that sounded ordinary until they didn't. "You don't have to know everything," he said quickly, sensing her unease. "I just need you to understand this part. If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident."
The word anything hung between them. Clara felt a tightening in her chest. "Lucas," she said softly, "you're scaring yourself." He shook his head. "I'm not scared. I'm being realistic." He reached into his bag and placed a small flash drive on the table, pushing it toward her but not letting go right away. His fingers lingered on the plastic, knuckles pale. "I need you to keep this," he said, "and if something happens, if I disappear, if I die, if I suddenly become a story everyone accepts too easily, you make this public." Her first reaction was refusal, not out loud but inside. Every part of her resisted the weight of what he was asking: responsibility, exposure, consequences. "Why me?" she asked. "Because you won't distort it," he replied without hesitation. "You won't add drama or remove facts. And because if I ask anyone else, they'll either panic or use it." Clara looked at the flash drive as if it might burn her. "And if nothing happens?"
Then you forget this conversation ever took place. She hesitated, calculating risks she didn't fully understand. The cafe noise returned gradually, clinking cups, distant voices, life continuing around them. "Promise me," Lucas said. She met his eyes. In them was not pressure, but trust, the kind that assumes agreement before it's spoken. "I promise," she said. Lucas exhaled, a tension leaving his shoulders. He released the flash drive. For a moment, everything felt strangely normal again. They talked a little longer after that, about trivial things, about plans that would never be made. When they stood to leave, Lucas hugged her tightly, longer than usual. As they parted, Clara felt a sudden, irrational urge to turn back, to say something else, to ask one more question. She didn't. At the time, the promise felt hypothetical, a precaution, a line drawn in an unlikely future.
She couldn't know that she had just agreed to carry a truth that would one day demand to be chosen. Nor could she know how easy it would be to break that promise when fear finally asked its price. Lucas died 3 weeks later. The news reached Clara through a short message from a mutual acquaintance, followed by a headline she refused to open. Sudden, tragic, no signs of struggle. The word suicide appeared quietly, almost apologetically, as if it were doing everyone a favor by explaining the unexplainable. She attended the funeral in a state of controlled detachment. She cried at the appropriate moments, accepted condolences, repeated phrases that sounded rehearsed even to her own ears. No one questioned her composure. People often mistook restraint for strength. The flash drive remained in her bag the entire time, a small, invisible weight pressing against her side. In the days that followed, Clara waited for fear to arrive fully formed, to scream, to demand action. Instead,
it crept in slowly, disguised as reason. She opened the files once, late at night, sitting at her desk with the lights turned low. What she saw confirmed Lucas's concern. Not everything made sense yet, but enough did. Enough to scare her. She imagined the consequences with unsettling clarity. Questions she wouldn't be able to answer. People who would deny everything. The possibility that telling the truth would change nothing except her own life. She told herself she needed time. Days became weeks. Weeks became a quiet agreement with herself. Now was not the right moment. There were investigations, formalities, grief to respect. Silence, she reasoned, was not betrayal, it was caution. Eventually, the world moved on. The case was closed. Conversations about Lucas softened, then faded. His name became something people mentioned with a sigh, a memory already losing its edges. Clara stored the flash drive in a drawer, beneath documents she never looked at.
Beneath things that belong to the present. She didn't destroy it. That mattered to her. It allowed her to believe she hadn't truly decided. Instead, she built a life where the promise existed only as an abstract idea, something that could, theoretically, still be fulfilled. A responsibility deferred, not denied. When guilt surfaced, she reframed it. I stayed alive, she told herself. I chose stability. She convinced herself that Lucas wouldn't have wanted her to sacrifice everything for a truth that might never be acknowledged. Over time, the fear dulled. The silence settled. Clara became someone who knew how to live with unfinished sentences. Until the night the message arrived. Until the past reached out, not in accusation, but in reminder. And in that moment, she understood what she had refused to admit for 5 years. Silence had never been a temporary choice. It had been her final answer. Clara listened to the message again the following night.
She waited until the apartment was completely silent, as if noise itself might interfere with what she was about to hear. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she pressed play and closed her eyes, forcing herself not to flinch at the sound of Lucas's voice. It was different now. The shock had faded, leaving room for something heavier. She noticed details she hadn't before, the slight pause before certain words, the careful tone, the way he spoke as if he were aware of being heard in the future. This was not a casual recording. It was deliberate, measured, prepared. You waited long enough, he had said. The sentence echoed in her mind, reshaping itself each time. Long enough for what? For courage? For fear to fade? Or simply long enough for guilt to grow unbearable? Clara began to imagine someone watching her, monitoring the moment she would finally listen. The thought unsettled her, even though reason told her it was impossible. Lucas was dead. The message was a relic.
Not a surveillance. Still, she checked the locks before sleeping. Still, she lowered her voice when replaying the audio, as if someone might overhear. At work, she found it harder to maintain distance. Conversations blurred together. Words like investigation, responsibility, truth surfaced in unrelated meetings, and each one landed with disproportionate force. She caught herself staring at her computer screen, seeing not documents, but the faint outline of a decision waiting to be made. By the third night, the message no longer felt like a mystery. It felt like a judgment. Lucas never accused her. He didn't need to. The calmness of his voice suggested certainty, not anger. He had trusted that she would eventually understand what was being asked of her, not as a friend, but as someone who knew the truth. Clara began to realize that the message wasn't asking whether she could fulfill the promise. It was asking why she still hadn't. She opened the drawer where the flash drive had been kept for years. It lay exactly where she remembered, untouched, unmarked by time. Holding it now, she felt an unexpected wave of resentment, not toward Lucas, but toward herself. She had believed silence would protect her. Instead, it had preserved the moment of choice, freezing it in place, waiting patiently for her to return. That night, Clara did not delete the message. She let it remain on her phone, unread, unheard by anyone else, a quiet presence that followed her from room to room, not threatening, not demanding, just waiting, as promises often do. Clara hadn't opened the files in years. She plugged the flash drive into her laptop with the same caution she might have used for something fragile or dangerous. The familiar folders appeared on the screen, unchanged, their names precise and unemotional. Dates, initials, scanned documents, audio clips she had never listened to. Nothing about them looked dramatic. That, she realized, was the most unsettling part. She moved slowly, opening one file at a time. Reports that contradicted official statements, email exchanges that revealed patterns no one had questioned, small inconsistencies that, taken alone, could be dismissed, but together formed a shape that was impossible to ignore. Lucas hadn't been reckless. He had been thorough. As she read, memories resurfaced with sharper edges, conversations she had brushed off, warnings she had reinterpreted as stress. The truth hadn't been hidden from her. It had been offered, patiently, and she had chosen not to look directly at it. What frightened her most was not what the files revealed, but how current they still felt. Names that remained influential, institutions unchanged. The past had not stayed in the past, it had simply gone quiet. Clara closed her laptop and leaned back, pressing her fingers against her temples. She understood now why Lucas had trusted her, not because she was brave,
but because she was careful, because she would verify, cross-check, resist exaggeration, because she would know this was real. The weight of that understanding settled heavily. If the truth still existed, so did her responsibility. Time had not erased it. Silence had only preserved it in perfect condition. She imagined releasing the information anonymously. No name attached, no face. Just facts placed where they couldn't be ignored. The thought brought a brief sense of relief, quickly followed by doubt. Anonymous truth still had consequences, and anonymity, she knew, was never absolute. Her phone buzzed softly on the desk. A reflexive jolt ran through her, but it was only a calendar reminder, something mundane and forgettable. Still, the interaction felt symbolic, life insisting on continuity, even as something fundamental began to shift beneath it. Clara realized then that she was no longer asking if she should act. She was asking how. The truth was not demanding urgency.
It wasn't shouting. It didn't need to. It was simply present, unchanged, waiting for the moment she would stop pretending it could disappear on its own. She closed the files again, but this time she didn't put the flash drive back in the drawer. She left it on the desk, in plain sight. For the first time in years, the truth was no longer hidden, and neither was her awareness of what it would cost. Clara didn't turn on any lights. The city outside her window glowed faintly, enough to outline the room without fully revealing it. She sat at her desk, the flash drive beside her laptop, the phone face up, silent. Everything she needed to decide was already there. Nothing else would arrive to help her. She thought about leaving it for the morning, about sleeping on it, as people said when they wanted time to soften a choice. But she knew sleep would only blur the edges, not change the shape of what waited for her. This night felt final. She opened a blank document.
The cursor blinked steadily, indifferent to her hesitation. She began typing facts first, dates, sequences, references. No accusations, no commentary, just the structure of something that could stand on its own. As she worked, fear rose and fell in waves. Not fear of exposure alone, but of recognition, of becoming visible in a way she had avoided for years. Silence had allowed her to exist without being seen too closely. Truth would not offer the same protection. She paused, hands hovering over the keyboard. Lucas's voice returned to her, not from the message, but from memory. Not dramatic, not pleading, certain, as if he had always known this moment would come, even if he hadn't lived to see it. Clara realized then that the hardest part wasn't risking something now. It was accepting that she had been willing to let the risk belong entirely to someone else. She stood, walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of water, and drank it slowly. The mundane action steadied her.
When she returned to the desk, the room felt smaller, more focused, as if everything unnecessary had fallen away. She attached the files. Her finger rested over the trackpad. One movement would be enough. There would be no confirmation, no immediate consequence, just a quiet release into a world that might or might not respond. Clara closed her eyes. For a brief moment, she imagined doing nothing, returning the flash drive to the drawer,
deleting the message, continuing the life she knew how to maintain. Then she imagined the years ahead, shaped by the same unfinished sentence. She opened her eyes. The cursor stopped blinking, and whatever she chose next would no longer belong to silence. Clara woke the next morning with the uneasy sensation that something had already happened without her. There was no message on her phone, no notification, no headline waiting to confirm or deny anything. The apartment looked exactly the same,
unchanged by whatever decision the night had held. For a moment, she wondered if that was the cruelest part, that the world rarely reacts on cue. She went through her morning routine more slowly than usual, noticing details she normally ignored. The sound of water in the sink, the light shifting across the wall. Each small continuity felt strangely deliberate, as if life were insisting on its right to proceed without explanation. At work, she sensed a subtle difference she couldn't quite name. Conversations felt sharper, faces more alert. Or maybe it was only her perception, stretched thin by anticipation. Every email she opened carried a faint tremor of expectation. Every unfamiliar name made her pause. Nothing happened. Days passed, then weeks. And then, quietly, without ceremony, the first sign appeared. Not addressed to her, not linked to her in any visible way. A brief article, an inquiry reopened, language careful enough to avoid conclusions.
Specific enough to suggest direction. No sources were cited. Clara read the piece once, then again. Her name wasn't there. Neither was Lucas's. The truth, if it was moving at all, was doing so without acknowledgement of who had set it in motion. At home that night, she opened her phone and deleted the message. The absence felt different than she expected. Not relief, not loss, just space. She understood now that confirmation was a luxury she would never have. There would be no moment of clarity where she could point to an outcome and say, "This is because of me." The truth didn't work that way. It traveled quietly, shedding origins, resisting ownership. What mattered, or so she told herself, was that it no longer depended on her silence. Still, as she lay in bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling around her, Clara felt the persistence of uncertainty. Not regret, not peace, something in between. Some actions did not ask to be witnessed. Some promises, once touched, continued forward on their own, leaving behind only the knowledge that they had been answered, even if no one would ever know how. Life did not change all at once. Weeks turned into months, and Clara learned how to inhabit the quiet that followed. It was not the same silence she had lived with before. That one had been defensive, carefully maintained. This new silence felt thinner, more honest, as if it no longer existed to protect her from herself. She followed the news without obsession. Some stories deepened, others faded. The world absorbed fragments of truth the way it always did, unevenly, imperfectly, without ceremony. Clara did not look for herself in the outcomes. She understood now that meaning did not require recognition. Sometimes Lucas crossed her mind unexpectedly, not as a ghost, not as an accusation, but as a presence anchored in memory. She realized she no longer avoided his name. She no longer needed to explain his absence to herself.
The promise had changed her, even if it had changed nothing else. On certain nights, Clara would pause before turning off the light, feeling the familiar impulse to review, to question, to replay. But the urge no longer consumed her. The past remained part of her, but it no longer waited to be answered. She had learned something simple and irrevocable. Some promises are not meant to save us. They are meant to follow us until we are ready to stop running. And once answered, they do not disappear. They settle quietly into who we become.